Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Cybrary podcast. It's just me today, Jonathan Meyers, the principal infrastructure engineer here at Cybrary. I've kidnapped Mike and locked him in a closet so that we can have conversations without him and him always staring in a certain direction. I got three guests today. Two you will look familiar. We have Mike and Josh from Shift 5, and then we also have TJ O'Connor, who's a professor. I'll let him do the introduction. He's a professor down in Florida. And TJ, over to you for a quick intro, and then we'll switch over to Mike and Josh.
Yeah, sure. My name is Dr. TJ O'Connor. I am the Cybersecurity Program Chair at Florida Tech, and I previously served as Mike's instructor at U.S. Military Academy.
Nice. Mike, recap for everybody.
Former Army officer, originally corrupted by Dr. O'Connor here, became a cyber officer doing cool stuff in the Army, and then co-founded Shift 5 with Josh. Josh, over to you.
Yeah. You guys have already given basically all the important parts of the intro, so I'm an amalgamation of the two. Met all three of these guys at West Point, co-founded Shift 5 with Mike after doing about half a career in the IC and Army Cyber Command.
Nice. TJ, do you want to start giving us a quick background? So you basically taught one or all of us at some point through some way, shape, or form at West Point. Kind of interested in how your teaching kind of career began, and then how it's progressed to where you are now.
Yeah, so just like the three of you, I went to the military academy. I commissioned as an Army officer. I commissioned into the branch at the time that was the Signal Corps that kind of handled all the technology for the Army, and then spent about 8 years in the active force. Most of it was in really fun assignments. I spent time in supporting a attack helicopter battalion, and then I spent a couple years supporting a special forces group downrange, and really had fun with that. And then kind of following those assignments, the Army does the right thing and sent me to grad school to go get a master's degree and then go up to teach to West Point. And that's where I guess I ran into Mike for the first time. And then we had you in class as well, I think too, right? The following year.
How did you end up at Florida Tech, I guess, is the bigger question.
So fast forward 12 years later. So I guess the big takeaway is that the experience that I had at West Point teaching, I absolutely fell in love with. It was something I really enjoyed. And so, still in the middle of an Army career, there's not really a lot of opportunities to be a permanent instructor while you're in the Army. So I finished my Army career in about 3 different special forces units, and then came all along working on my PhD. And then immediately upon retiring, I rolled right into the position I have now and have had for a couple of years teaching down at Florida Tech.
Nice. So you said you're the cybersecurity chair, I think is what you said?
Yep.
What does that entail for us non-civilian university attenders types?
Yeah, so I oversee the curriculum development for both our graduate cyber program and our undergraduate program in computer science that has a cyber operations concentration.
And then, so you guys do a bunch of cyber defense exercises and things like that. Can you kind of talk me through how that kind of works?
Sure. So we have a team here, FITSEC, that Florida Tech and Florida Institute of Technology Cybersecurity. And that team competes in a wealth of different competitions. And so we've done everything from the traditional kind of defense-like exercises like the collegiate cyber defense competition to some of the offensive competitions like the National Cyber Penetration Test competition, and then the traditional kind of Jeopardy style CTFs. And recently that includes the National Cyber League and and just kind of weekly CTFs that are kind of available.
Yeah, I don't think any of these existed when we were going through, right? We only had the one, what was it? The one big cyber defense exercise that everybody got really excited about. I remember who was it? It was Colonel Goda was always standing up on the poop deck in the mess hall, just cheering. And remember, it was the big old lead ups where everybody was just cheering because they were these nerds are just going so crazy over the dumbest things. I'm super interested in kind of how you've seen that evolve over time, right? Because I don't think cyber wasn't really big back in 2009 when we were all kind of doing it. And there was just one big exercise, and it was basically only the service academies. I don't think there was any civilian equivalent at the time. And I'm super interested in that kind of like progression, because I think cyber defense exercises are kind of like a key pillar of like continuous learning, and especially trying to get like new people into the field. I think those are like a great way to kind of like get you involved really quickly to kind of see and do a lot of cool things.
Yeah, so at the military academy, what we had was what the NSA sponsored, which was the cyber defense exercise. It's kind of an unfair competition with fair rules. They put you inside of a network that has kind of already been compromised by teams at the National Security Agency, and you have to kind of fight your way out of that network and secure it.
Terrible.
It's a losing proposition from the beginning. It's just how much you lose in comparison to the other teams. And I think there's a lot of great lessons there that go on. And they exist in both strategic and kind of tactical decision making. That I think a lot of our students got very good at specific skill sets like intrusion detection or configuration of firewalls. But at a bigger level, it allows you to kind of see what was going on in the course of an attack, and to both kind of prepare for that inbound attack that you knew was going to happen, and then once it happened, kind of manage the chaos. And the years that we did really well, I would say it was less of an effort in technical preparation and more of an effort in chaos management. I think the final year where we kind of ran away with that, we won 2 to 3 years that I was there. The final year that Mike's team won, and I think you were on that one as well, Jonathan, or
I was the year before.
Okay.
Yeah.
The final team that I know Mike's won, our captain at the time was someone that was just really relaxed, an individual that kind of had the ability to just kind of talk real gently to his peers and motivate them, but in the same token, not really stress anyone else when the chaos happened. And I think that was a lesson that I hopefully translated to kind of all the students, and that they carried well past how you configure Snort.
Yeah. Mike, do you remember what your assignment was? Like what your little area was that you were working?
I remember Mike's assignment.
I do. So interestingly, it was a really exciting opportunity for me because I had also just had my wisdom teeth removed. So I was on some pretty strong drugs through the entire experience. Let's see. I remember specifically having a hand in like helping configure these free BSD machines, which prior to the preparation for this, I had no experience with whatsoever. And TJ, this was your idea, I think, right? Was we were going?
That was definitely Eric's idea that we always use BSD because it offset the offense. They weren't prepared for it, and the aspect of kind of containers too.
They didn't know how to signaturize many of the OSs when we would like take a free BSD image and then like heavily modify everything, like recompile all kinds of stuff from source, just make everything as unique as humanly possible. It would really kind of strip the red team cell's ability to just use like canned capabilities right out of a Kali distro. At the time, it was called something different, but no, I think TJ tells the story a little bit better.
Backtrack.
It was Backtrack. That's right.
Yeah. I think I got stuck with the fun one, or I had 2. I don't know why I had 2. I think there was some other people that weren't carrying their weight, and I got stuck with 2. I had to defend the Active Directory boxes, which was just a nightmare. Like it was just like, yeah, here, just take this. And then I also had the email server. The email server was infinitely easier because I think we were just running postfix on a Unix box. So it was like, oh, I can do that. That's pretty easy. The Active Directory one was a nightmare. And I know way more about like Active Directory, what they used to call it, the SSLF, like the specific profiles that you could push out to computers to like lock everything down. Since I think I just cranked it up to like 11 because we didn't have like actual users that were like using the end devices. And so like I could just lock down everything. I could be like, no, you can't use Internet Explorer or something like that.
Yeah.
And
so turns out cinder blocks are pretty secure computers.
Yeah, but I think they still got in, right? Like it was like Dr. O'Connor was saying, like it was like unfair.
They got in once and one time only. And I guess I'll tell the story because Mike kind of hinted at it. Mike was one of the best students we ever had at the military academy, so I don't want to distinguish away from that. But but Mike did just have his wisdom teeth done. So we had allocated him probably the simplest task possible. Take a BSD box and install Nagios on it and just set up Nagios. And we figured that's the one thing that just, he could probably accomplish that while and heavily medicated from his wisdom teeth surgery. And unfortunately, he configured it with default credentials, Nagios. Now, for 3 years, I had been mocking every friend of mine that was on the red team, saying, "You will never get into us." And the second they got in, I got a text message about it from Raf Mudge, who is the creator of Cobalt Strike / Armitage. He was on the team, and he texted me to let me know that the streak had been broken. And so, being young and ambitious and slightly capricious, Mike and I probably had a conversation after that that probably didn't respect my best attitude. But yeah, that's the only time they got in during at least the 3 years I was there. And it's because, we just broke every rule set possible within the context of the rules.
It's a fantastic learning experience. So fortunately, we had appropriately DMC'd the Nagios box, so it was a completely useless penetration from their perspective. But actually, my favorite memory from that particular exercise was so a unique inject that year was that the red team got to provide the configuration for what was called the general's laptop. So basically, they got the opportunity to drop a virtual machine image for a VIP that was going to be on the enclave. So if they couldn't break in, then by God, they were going to inject themselves in with this just totally owned image that was going to wreak havoc on the network. So one of my classmates had the ingenious idea of leveraging Metasploit to remotely administrate that box, which at the time there was not specific rules developed around you can't hack your own computers in order to use them to just in rapid fire just kill adversarial processes as an administration technique. So that was a lot of fun. Do you remember some of those conversations, TJ, around the white cell and the red team being really upset
so,
about?
I mean, it was an interesting opportunity to understand where rule sets need to be clearly defined first for competitions, if you want them to be clearly defined. And this is kind of one of these interesting aspects of cybersecurity. I think with Jeopardy style CTFs, if you get to a solution, it doesn't matter. However you got to it, whatever unintended path you take exceeds in success, then it counts and it scores. In cyber defense exercises, we try to constrain them more to achieve specific learning objectives. And sometimes that makes things like remote administration with Metasploit appear out of scope, but technically are kind of still in scope. So I remember we had a great debate about that with the organizers of the competition. We went into if I remember correctly, we went into the Metasploit source code, and it was the PSExec module for Metasploit. And we explained that, and the ruling was that if PSExec was allowed to remotely administer, which they conceded it was, then the Metasploit version of PSExec, despite the kind of wealth of post-exploit tools that we used, was in scope because it was the same exact essential kind of avenue. And not everyone was happy about that at the time. We were happy about the ruling. We definitely fought for the ruling. But it did hurt some feelings because it probably was on the borderline of what we should and shouldn't do.
And we probably took the wrong lesson away, because I remember some of my classmates years later trying to figure out why they couldn't get these remote administration tools approved through an RMF process, and people were just fainting at the sight of Metasploit on an accreditation packet.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's a lot of that's the beauty of cybersecurity, right? Is the ability to kind of think outside the box and find the back way in, because I mean, that's how these massive attacks occur, right? Nobody's just, well, hopefully nobody's, doing the the SolarWinds attack and just ran like a Metasploit toolkit and got in, right? Like you would assume that it was at least that secure, and somebody did something creative. And it's like, how do you start to get people to think about these like creative avenues and ways in? And I would argue that like probably one of the only ways is to see it happen once or twice to get you to kind of start tinkering in your mind. Like, oh, well, if I come in, left and then right, it's a little bit easier to kind of get them to start thinking that way. Josh, did you ever, I don't know if you ever did any CTFs at West Point, because you were like off doing, I don't know what you were doing.
Yeah.
But I don't think it was schoolwork.
No, I didn't really get into cybersecurity, ironically, until after I graduated. But what's funny about like using Metasploit for defensive purposes, I think it like underlines a really interesting a really interesting point, which is the difference between a hunt tool or EDR tool and a rootkit is really just intent, right? It's like you're using the exact same techniques to try to hunt for intrusions and remediate them as you are when you're attacking. I mean, the system doesn't care who you are; it's just executing code, right? So I think you guys were onto something, probably a decade ahead of the cybersecurity industry.
So
it's almost like go ahead.
So I was going to say, it's kind of one of the kind of mentors of the program that we had that came in from the outside was Mudge from the Loft, and phenomenal information security expert. And he did a lot to talk to students occasionally. We did a panel with them. I think Mike did an internship with him at DARPA when he was a PM down there. And then we got to see the whole cyber fast track unroll and his efforts on that. But at one point when he was speaking to the cadets, something he said, and I'll just absolutely never forget it. He said, when you develop a tool, if you don't understand its offensive purpose and its defensive purpose, you haven't fully fleshed out that tool yet. Like every tool has an offensive and defensive purpose. And if you haven't figured out what it is, then your tool probably isn't complete. You haven't seen all aspects of it. And I absolutely love flipping that paradigm because I think any offensive tool is fully capable of being a defensive tool, and every defensive tool is fully capable of being an offensive tool. And
I think it's crazy.
Explanation of how EDR and rootkits work is exactly right. I mean, they just hook different things, and whoever hooks first wins.
Yeah, it's crazy how like this whole notion of like the computer virus got invented many, many, many years ago, and now it's like all these things are still very similar to how we do like vaccines and virus and stuff like that. Like it's crazy how it's still like we still find ways to relate it back to like the virus and like things like that. Because up until the most recent one, like you're basically fighting the virus with the virus, and it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like here we go.
It's still all about executing code, though, right? Like even the most recent vaccines, it's just getting the body to
hacking this
proteins.
code.
Yeah, it's just make these proteins. And it's a similar thing when you're on an endpoint. You're like run these instructions, and whether you get them to be run. I mean, like modern EDR tools, just like riffing on what TJ's saying here, is you don't want to get detected by the bad guys because they're also looking for you. So it's this sort of spy versus spy game, and you're using the same techniques. You look at modern EDR tools, and it's like they're all using reflective loading, and they're staying off a disk, and they're like dynamically loading functions and all this like stealthy stuff that we used to see from advanced APTs. Now it's just like advanced APTs. They're just called APTs. You're seeing the exact same thing in EDR. So I think this is like just a common kind of like a common theme across all these industries. It's just you're all using the same techniques. You're part of the same game, and it's just intent. It's what are you trying to get out of this system?
Along those lines, what do you think about the recent FBI auto securing Exchange servers?
I got opinions.
Yeah, boy.
Well, I mean, Josh, I think it works well to that previous episode we did with the government backdoors,
Yeah.
right? Like it fits right in line with that. Like it would be much easier for them to patch if there was just that encryption backdoor. They could just walk right in, as opposed to them, having to come in and patch. I think it's an interesting topic, right? Because like legally, if you look at their charter, right? Like, what's their charter? It's like to protect the citizens of the United States against, foreign actors, right? I think is something similar. If not, it should be. And so it's kind of interesting in that aspect. I don't know if I'm a super hardcore corporate client, do I want them doing that? But at the end of the day, if you're super hardcore and you left it open, I mean, I don't know. I think it's questionable, right? Because nobody's going to say anything if it was just some rogue group on the internet, right? Which we've seen before. Like the good guy Greg comes in and just starts patching people's things, but he's not associated with like a government entity or a nation state or anything like that. And people are like, "Oh, good job, Greg." Like I'm sure some people at that company are very pissed off because you basically just big dog them and been like, "Oh, I can patch your systems faster than you, and I'm not even a member." And so I think it's an interesting conversation. I don't know if it's a slippery slope, right? Like at what level, like do they just start, I mean, we talked about them creating like a cyber agency, right? And if they're just always scanning US servers, looking for open S3 buckets and things like that, and just kind of letting I don't know if that's appropriate use of government funds, but it's an interesting idea. Especially, I don't know, as cybersecurity becomes like an everyday, like, problem now that affects everybody, not just, corporate clients and things like that. I don't know. Josh, what do you got?
Yeah, I mean, I think to the immediate point of like people use the exact same techniques and it's all just a matter of intent and perspective. I mean, TJ, I think it's a perfect example. You've got basically the setup is you have these Outlook servers that have really critical vulnerabilities on them. Bad actors have like web shells, which are just essentially like arbitrary remote access kinds of kit on these things. And the FBI got a warrant from a Texas judge to go exploit onto these servers. So basically, use the same exact access vector as the attackers did to get onto these systems. But their intent was, rather than to use these as infrastructure or steal information off of them or whatever, was to kick the bad guys out. So there are like layers of interesting things to this story. I mean, one is, along this theme of just, they're using the exact same kinds of access vectors and things. It's just another example of that happening. I think the broader question, which I think a lot of people in the information security community have a lot of opinions about, is like, should the FBI have done that? Like, should they have the ability to get a warrant to go in and do this? Because the enterprises, at least as far as we know, and as far as the warrant knows, hadn't done anything wrong besides like have malware running on one of their Outlook servers. So one of the questions is, do we as like American citizens and enterprises have the right to be dumb and not patch our systems? Are there some sort of extenuating circumstances that basically like, I almost liken it to like the sort of tragedy.
Not getting the vaccine.
Yeah, like not getting a vaccine, exactly. Or an analogy I used the other day was like, say you have like a termite infestation in your house, and like you have a right to be dumb and like not get rid of those termites, but now you just created a hazard for your neighbors. Like that's sort of where these things get a little bit interesting. To be clear, I don't know that these Outlook servers being compromised caused any sort of like existential threat to other like third parties, but I think that's probably where they were trying to go with it. Yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think?
So getting a warrant approved to essentially conduct a search, which I think is probably what the judge was specifically ruling on, is interesting when the probable cause or the legal grounds for that are unclear. You mentioned that like these unpatched servers and their owners really hadn't done anything. Ironically, that's the problem. They hadn't patched them, but by not patching them, they hadn't committed any kind of crime or arguably any harm to others. I think that that might be something that could probably be argued in a court of law. It's interesting too to consider what would the ramifications be if during a patching operation, one of these automated patching operations, there was some impact monetarily or otherwise that was able to directly or indirectly be attributed to the FBI's actions. Like I just, having been a fly on the wall to listening to like DoD lawyers debate different types of cyber operations, I can only imagine what the legal discussion was internal to the FBI. And I actually think that if there was some way that legal discussion could have been recorded and maybe shared like in edited form to the community, it would be a fascinating read or listen. I really truly think that could be some really great material, probably for for the students, TJ, that you talk to. I'm sure there's some type of ethics theme in some of your courses. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I mean it's definitely an interesting question, right? And I think you can make the argument on either side. You can make the argument that it exceeds the scope of what they should be doing, and you can make the argument that for the security of nearby partners, they had to do it. My general thought is, as long as the scope was narrow enough of what they did, right, and you could kind of guarantee that it's not going to include any damage, then I think they're okay. If it's simply going in to disable a web shell by pulling that web shell out and stopping it from calling home, I'm okay with that. If they are auto patching devices that are in production serving a community and they're not notifying those individuals, that's an interesting kind of question. There's precedent for it because several companies have done that, right? Apple pulled stores of applications off phones. So has Google, right? With the Google Play Store, where an application is known to be vulnerable, they'll pull it off a device. But having the federal government do it is an interesting kind of turn.
Do we know, did they attempt to contact the system owners ahead of time? I'm sure they did.
It was post facto as far as I'm aware.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. So I'm just predicting that.
Yeah. I mean, think about this. You've got their communications infrastructure is compromised.
That's fair. So I'm curious to see, I'm sure that we'll see more of these now that there's at least one, case or one ruling in this direction. But I am concerned and worried when official government entities start to see this as part of their charter, because I think that there's always this fear of scope creep that we see that in a lot of similar, court cases and rulings. And I TJ, to your point, this sounds great, but I worry like where things would be in another 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, right.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Take like the pipeline attack, right? So you have the pipeline attack going on that now has a substantial impact, ransomware. Imagine that an agency could immediately remote into the first machine that was compromised and shut it down before it spread to nearby workstations within that company. Do you want that or do you not want that? And at what point, where's that line get drawn?
There's also, I think, really important philosophical questions here around law enforcement entities doing this sort of thing. Suppose you've got an operator on a box and they see evidence of a crime. So, you got a warrant to go in, remediate a third-party intrusion. You're on an email server, you're on, file share, and you see, take the most extreme example, like whatever that is, you see evidence of a crime there. How do you deal with that? Is it now, are you sort of, how do you deal with that? You went in with a specific purpose without probable cause for a crime, but now you found another. You know what I mean? It's like it opens up a whole can of worms that I'm sure like first year law students are going to be debating about for the next century.
Yeah, and I think there's also another interesting point, right? Like, what if it's not the case, but like, what if the FBI is just trying to be efficient, right? Because if they do end up getting hacked, the FBI has to get called in dedicate a ton of resources to go investigate and determine and do all of this work when they could have just patched it in 5 minutes and been done. And it's like, okay, cool. We can actually spend time on, working on actual like hardcore hacks, and we can dedicate those resources and be better at finding that stuff. Yeah. I also think it's interesting that if they just scan and kind of know this, like you have beat cops that walk around neighborhoods that are observing for crimes, right? Like if these boxes are open to the world and accessible, if they're just happen to be like around and they witness a crime occur or the evidence that a crime occurred, right? Like they find a finger in the bushes, right? Like, is that any different now that we're kind of moving towards this like completely online world? Or is there some sort of like delineation that can be drawn there, right? I mean, if you're just out and about looking at publicly accessible systems, does, the FBI or whoever, like some future cyber thing, have that authority or that like mandate to like make sure, people are protected when it's on the public domain, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an argument that if you have compromisable infrastructure out there, that an attacker can collect into either their attack infrastructure or some kind of bot to do nefarious things. There's there's a very reasonable argument to be made that you are creating, by having that sort of compromisable stuff out there, you are creating conditions that deteriorate like the safety and functionality of the internet. Like there's it's just a matter of degrees, right? It's like so I don't know. Like TJ said, you could argue both sides of this. I mean, I know there are like vociferous defenders on Twitter. I mean, you almost don't even need to say that with Twitter, but there are there are people on real extremes of this issue who, for example, they say, well, look, I mean, we have really strong tradition in this country against illegal search and seizure, right? And there have to be just absolutely exigent circumstances for you to violate someone's due process. And I mean, in this case, they got a warrant, but it was sort of like a no-knock warrant, right? And there was no crime that was committed, right? As far as the legal code is concerned, like having an Outlook server that's unpatched does not make you culpable of a crime. So I think that is where the hypersensitivity is coming into play, is that people are like, there was no crime committed, yet the government still issued a warrant for a law enforcement agency to go in and use force, right? Use basically what is tantamount to criminal activity, like the criminal techniques of getting onto this server without permission to go do some activity. And that, I think that just, especially in this country, like gives people real cause, because we, real cause for concern, because we have such a strong tradition against allowing the government to do these sorts of things.
Yeah. So I think
Jonathan, just tailing on to
the FBI does
Josh's
really good
comments.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. There is a delay. So after you, TJ.
No, go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
So just tagging on to Josh's comments, I think another component of the angst around this conversation kind of relates back to, an established theme of who's responsible, accountable, and liable for cyber attacks. So up until this point, the owner operator of infrastructure is the one that ultimately holds the liability bag, right? We haven't seen anybody, due to these really long form, end user license agreements and all of this other, legalese. Nobody has successfully been able to shift the blame to a software manufacturer or to an operating system, OEM, right, for cyber attacks, vulnerabilities, et cetera. It's always been on the owner operator, even when there were flaws in the product that they bought and are now operating. Up until this point, the law enforcement and U.S. federal government has taken the approach of, hey guys, it's on you. It's the Wild West. It's not even really clear, I feel, in the community, like what the law enforcement support role is, except to maybe conduct an investigation and pursue prosecution and investigation, like when crimes are deemed to be committed. But it's unclear like how and when, especially federal law enforcement, chooses to pursue certain investigations and hacks for prosecution as opposed to others. And now this in the mix. And so I feel like part of the debate is talking about at the meta level, like what is our government's role in securing and providing either incident response, which you could argue this might fall under, or some type of active hunt or proactive defense of private infrastructure. We, going back to kind of the traditional law enforcement role, talking about police officers doing a beat, doing a neighborhood patrol. We pay for and expect some level of services like that. We also pay for and expect public good, like the fire department, to come help us put our house out before it catches the rest of the block on fire. And I think that this is probably that next use case in a larger debate about the evolution of law enforcement and especially our government's involvement in the security of digital infrastructure. I think that this is an overdue debate, but certainly an interesting use case.
Do you think, supposing that, I think you can make the reasonable argument that enterprises, private citizens have like a responsibility as internet citizens to keep their devices free of malware to some sort of reasonable extent, that through patching and things that are reasonably available to them. I think that's kind of like so much of this is predicated on that people have a responsibility to do that. And, if so, could you imagine a setup where essentially you have the ability to like opt out of the government's ability to compromise your device and go on and like fix it, but that just like, failing to mow your grass or, keep your sort of house in order, you could be fined, for example, for not having, a patched operating system or service, if it's getting actively compromised, and sort of, put it back on people to say, look, like we get it, you don't like this government overreach. Given that we sort of, as an internet community, need to keep these devices free of malware, you have two choices. Either we're going to fix it for you, or you're going to give us permission to basically get onto this device to fix stuff. Or you're going to say, no, you don't have the ability, but if you find, evidence of kind of malware on it, you're going to get fined for it,
No, I think what we're all kind of hitting
I
at
think it's
is where the ownership exists. And Mike really said it best. Who's really at fault, and who's really responsible for the fix? Is it the software vendor? Is it the federal government? Is the individual end user required to put protection mechanisms in place that prevent attacks regardless of the vulnerability of the software? Who and really, I think this is something that we've struggled with in information security for a very long time and never really solved, is ultimately who's responsible, and where blame gets shifted is sometimes unbelievable. I mean, the SolarWinds attack, right? You have the CEO going on television and saying that one intern put one password as admin 123 or whatever, or SolarWinds 123, and tried to at some point at least mitigate their responsibility in it by pointing to an intern. I think we all at times struggle with, ownership over who is ultimately responsible when we have kind of an epic failure happen.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting way, especially like if you look at how the cloud providers, right, like Amazon and Google and Azure, use the shared responsibility model to like defer like who's responsible for patching images and get it off their shoulders and things like that. I think this could be possibly like an extension of that, but at the end of the day, there's probably something that needs to be set up, because I would argue the people that are now being able to like spin up boxes and connect things to the internet, like their level of, knowledge in the space is getting lower and lower because it's easier and easier to do this. And so I'm not advocating for more government oversight, but I think there just needs to be some clearly defined lines on like who's responsible. Because even with the shared responsibility model, right? Like if you get an image that gets owned on Amazon detects it and immediately kills it, right? Like they shut it down. They say like, hey, your machine was overtaken and then caused a denial of service attack on like these 4,000 other machines. And they kind of step in. And I think maybe kind of having a level of that defined clearly for like other devices that are sitting on the internet, it's like, hey, there's like a certain threshold, but like once this starts to happen, we're going to step in and take it down, right? Like we're going to step in after we see your home camera talking to 4,000 other home cameras, right? Like that shouldn't be happening. And we'll step in and then take over that. And so I think it's going to be super interesting because a lot of these softwares and things like that are now all consolidating in these cloud providers. And it's going to be interesting where the cloud provider versus like the software vendor is kind of responsible, right? Because I don't know why the FBI didn't go to, say, Microsoft and just be like, hey, force patch this version, right? Like anybody running this, just push the force patch, right? We've seen Apple do that in iOS exploits that are being actively exploited. They just pushed a security update overnight and forced it on everybody's phones, right? And so I don't know if we can kind of get to that spot where it's like Microsoft, you have this like very insecure thing that is starting to be actively exploited. Like you push it and it's just part of your, software license agreement that like, if there's a critical thing, we're going to patch it and just, do it that way. And so I don't know.
I think you have two different things happening in the
Go ahead.
In the chopper attacks. And what's really interesting about that is that I think the FBI chooses really interesting cases sometimes to make kind of prominent. They did this with the San Bernardino shooter to kind of talk about the role of vendors putting in encryption backdoors. And I think they selectively chose this one to have a discussion about the role of government in attacking. And the unique aspect is, Microsoft can absolutely patch Exchange to prevent future vulnerabilities, but Microsoft probably is very uncomfortable, I have to assume, with going in and removing web shells or files off of a user system that they did not originally create, right? And there's some liability issues there. Maybe a user has a legitimate PHP script running on a web server and they pull it off, and now they're vulnerable to their customer. That just looks bad. And so there's an interesting division of labor there. I think most software vendors have no problem auto forcing a patch under exigent circumstances, but individually start touching users' files, I think they're very uncomfortable with. And so it's an interesting division of labor.
I'm actually kind of surprised. Oh, sorry. There's the lag. And TJ, you said bring up like a kind of really interesting question, which is I'm actually surprised that the attackers didn't close the door behind them, right? Like one of the things that was weird about this is that typically if you're an APT and you gain access on infrastructure, like you don't want the ability for others, whether that's other bad guys or the FBI or whoever, to come in and clean up. So you'll typically do things like either disabling patching to make sure that like you don't get the system into a state where you can no longer execute, or like potentially patch the issue yourself, right, as part of your exploitation thing. What a nice thing for them to do for you, so that like you make sure that you've gained access, and it makes it hard for people to remediate and for other people to use that access, potentially blow your cover.
Jonathan, I just want to underscore your proposal for, clear guidelines on responsibilities and who's accountable across kind of the entire life cycle of a technology system, the software and hardware, absolutely is necessary. Just, quick shout out to like what Josh and I do on a daily basis. We operate in the OT space where there really is not a concept of patching or regularly updating firmware and software on board different, embedded computers and heavy equipment. So it's almost like being in the early 90s where, security patches, I'm thinking to myself like, man, wouldn't that be great if we had the ability to do that? We could be such responsible citizens. But the problem that I run into in meetings with vendors and with OEMs and with operators on a near daily basis is that many operators look to the suppliers, the supplier community, and say, well, that's their problem. And I'm captive to that supplier community. And then the supplier community says, well, it's not our problem because like we sell a thing and there's no subscription model to it. And so why am I responsible for, continuing to fix it maintain it, secure it, down the road. Plus, it's no longer even my stuff. Like I sold a product in a traditional market. It's out of my hands. It's now their problem. And so, ironically, in the operational technology world, often you find that nobody is taking any responsibility or accountability. And that leads to the worst security outcome, which is that nobody's doing anything about it. So I think that the discussion about responsibility and accountability, what those roles are, I would really love to see that conversation continue and hopefully be applied to critical infrastructure markets and operational technology verticals where right now I think that conversation is sorely needed.
The perfect way to end the podcast with that. I want to thank all y'all for coming on today, having a great discussion. I think it was super interesting. And it was a lot of fun. So I appreciate it. Thanks everybody for being on. And that does it for this episode of the Cybrary podcast. Thanks, guys.